Margaret Hale kept her ledger wrapped in oilcloth, tucked beneath the loose floorboard beside her bed. It was the first thing she touched each morning, and the last thing she checked before sleep. The book was thick, its leather cracked from age and weather, its pages filled in a careful slanted hand. Names filled it, hundreds of them. Some had dates, some had places. Some had only a single line, written because no one else would remember them. She had been a widow for 11 years. The town of Dry Creek barely remembered her husband now. Thomas Hale had died building the north spur of the rail line, crushed beneath a shifting beam. The company paid her nothing but a folded letter and a handshake, heavy with regret. Margaret buried him herself, marked the grave with a wooden cross, and wrote his name into the ledger that very night. That was when the habit began. At first, it was only the men who died alone, drifters, laborers, ranch hands whose families lived too far away to ever hear the truth. Margaret wrote them down so they wouldn't vanish entirely. She believed that as long as a name was written, a soul was not lost. Dry Creek tolerated her. Some called her kind. Others whispered that she was strange. A few swore she was cursed, that death followed her pencil wherever it went. Margaret paid no mind. She lived in a narrow house at the edge of town, took in mending, and attended every burial, whether she was invited or not. The morning Gideon Cross rode into town, Margaret was standing at the edge of Boot Hill, brushing dirt from her gloves. She noticed him, immediately not because he was handsome, though he was, in a rough road-worn way, but because he looked like a man, listening for something behind him. His horse was lathered despite the cool air, and his eyes never stayed still. When he dismounted near the saloon, Margaret felt a strange tightening in her chest, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She went home and opened the ledger. The page was already there. Gideon Cross. No date, no place, only a single word beneath the name, written in her own hand, though she did not remember writing it. Running, Margaret closed the book so fast, her fingers stung. She had never written a living man's name before. For the rest of the day, she tried to convince herself it meant nothing. Yet every task slipped from her grasp. Her needle pricked her thumb twice. She burned the bread. When evening came, she found herself standing across the street from the saloon, watching Gideon cross through the open doors. He laughed once, sharp and brief, as if unused to the sound. He drank whiskey, but didn't linger. When a pair of men entered and fell silent at the sight of him, Gideon's hand drifted casually, instinctively toward his holster. Margaret knew that movement. She had seen it on men whose names already filled her book. That night, she dreamed of ink spreading across a page like blood through sand. When she woke, the ledger lay open beside her bed. Gideon Cross's name had not changed, but Margaret knew, with a certainty that frightened her more than loneliness ever had, that fate had ridden into Dry Creek on a tired horse, and it had already been written down. Gideon Cross did not intend to stay in Dry Creek. That much was clear by the way he rose before dawn, watered his horse himself, and kept his bedroll tied tight, even after paying for a room upstairs. Men who planned to settle loosened their knots. Gideons were ready for flight. Margaret noticed these things because she had learned to watch. The dead always left signs before they became names in her ledger. She saw him each morning. Now Gideon ate sparingly at the cafe, eggs, black coffee, no conversation. He sat where he could see the door and the street beyond it. When footsteps passed too slow or voices dropped too low, his shoulders tightened and his eyes sharpened like a blade finding its edge. On the third day, he caught her looking. "Do I know you?" he asked, stepping into her path outside the general store. Margaret's breath stalled. Up close, he looked more tired than dangerous. Dust clung to his boots, and a thin scar cut through one eyebrow, pale against sun-darkened skin. "No," she said honestly. "I just live here." He studied her face as if weighing something unseen. "You watch like someone expecting trouble." She almost laughed. "And you walk like someone carrying it." A corner of his mouth twitched. Fair enough. They stood there a moment longer than propriety allowed. Margaret felt the pull again, that quiet, unsettling certainty that his presence was not an accident. She turned away first, heart thudding. That afternoon, Gideon came to her house. Margaret nearly dropped the kettle when she saw him through the window. She composed herself before opening the door, smoothing her apron, lifting her chin. "I was told you keep records," Gideon said. She stiffened. "Who told you that?" "Gravedigger," he shrugged. "Said if anyone could tell me who died here recently, it'd be you." Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Her home smelled of ink and dried sage. Gideon glanced around, his gaze catching on the shelves of notebooks stacked along the wall. His jaw tightened. "That's a lot of names," he said quietly. "Someone should remember them," Margaret replied. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because the world forgets easily." He nodded, as if that answer made a kind of sense. "I'm looking for a man. Name's Calhoun. Tall, mean, likely to leave bodies in his wake." Margaret's fingers curled slowly. She moved to the shelf, pulled down the ledger, and flipped through its pages. Her pulse roared in her ears. Calhoun was there. So were 3 men from towns Gideon had passed through. She did not tell him that. "No Calhoun here," she said, instead closing the book. Gideon exhaled, relief flickering too quickly to hide. "Then I won't trouble you further." He turned to leave, then paused. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Margaret thought of Thomas's grave, of the ledger beneath her floorboard, of the name already written. "No," she said. "This is where I belong." Gideon studied her as if he wanted to argue but didn't know how. "If you ever change your mind," he said softly, "don't wait too long." After he left, Margaret sank into a chair, hands trembling. She pulled the ledger back down, opened it to Gideon's page. The word beneath his name had changed. Running was crossed out. Below it, written in darker ink, was a new word: staying. Margaret closed the book and pressed it to her chest. For the first time since her husband's death, she prayed not for remembrance, not for peace, but for a man who was trying desperately to outrun a fate she feared she could not erase. Dry Creek changed Gideon Cross. Margaret saw it in the way his steps slowed, in how he lingered after meals, in the way his eyes no longer scanned every shadow like it held a rifle. He took work repairing fences on the South Ranch, accepted credit at the general store, and even laughed once really. Laughed when a child's hoop rolled into his legs. And Margaret hated herself for noticing how that laugh sounded. They began to speak often, their conversations quiet and careful. Like 2 people walking the edge of a river neither dared to cross. Gideon walked her home from church on Sundays, his hat in his hands, respectful and strangely shy. Margaret mended his coat one evening, her fingers brushing his sleeve, and the contact sent a jolt through them both. "You're good with your hands," Gideon said. "I have practice," she replied, and did not say with what. That night, Margaret opened the ledger. Gideon's page frightened her now. The ink bled no matter how gently she touched it. Words shifted when she wasn't looking. Once she swore the page felt warm beneath her fingers. She tried to erase his name, scratched at it with her nail, until her finger split but the letters only darkened. Bold and unyielding. She had never tried to change fate before. One evening, Gideon arrived at her door with blood on his knuckles. "I need help," he said, voice tight. She pulled him inside without question. The cut was shallow, but the bruise beneath it spoke of violence. Gideon washed his hands at her basin, staring into the water as if it might answer him. "They found me," he said at last. Margaret's chest hollowed. "Who?" "Men I used to ride with." His jaw clenched. "Men who don't let debts go." She wanted to tell him to leave, to run to save himself, but the ledger's words burned in her mind. "Staying. How long do you have?" she asked. "Maybe a day. Maybe a week." He looked at her then, really looked. "I won't bring trouble to your door, I swear." "You already have," she said gently. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither dared name. That night, Margaret dreamed of Thomas. He stood at the foot of her bed, face kind but sad. "You can't save them all," he said. "I have to try," she whispered. She woke with tears on her face, and the ledger opened beside her. A date had appeared beneath Gideon's name. It was soon. Margaret's breath broke. She slammed the book shut, heart racing. She would not accept this. Not now. Not when Gideon had begun to imagine a life beyond running. The next morning, she made her choice. She told Gideon everything. They sat at her small table, sunlight spilling across the worn wood. She placed the ledger between them and opened it to his page. "I write the names of the dead," she said, "and sometimes the names come before the death." Gideon stared. "You're saying I'm already written," she finished. "Yes." He went pale, then laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "That's a cruel joke. I wish it were." She showed him the date. The laughter died in his throat. For a long moment, Gideon said nothing. Then he closed the book with a careful hand. "Then, I suppose I should leave," he said quietly. Margaret reached for him before fear could stop her. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, warm and real. "No," she said. "We'll change it." Gideon looked at her like a man seeing hope for the first time, like one who feared believing in it. "All right," he said. "But if I die, I won't let it be because I ran." Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the sound of approaching hooves. Fate, it seemed, was already on the move. The men arrived at dusk. Margaret saw them first. From her window, 3 riders cutting through the edge of Dry Creek like a blade through cloth. They didn't slow, didn't look around. Men like that never did. They knew where they were going. Gideon stood beside her, already reaching for his gun belt. "It's Calhoun," he said, "and he didn't come to talk." Margaret's hands shook, but her voice did not. "Then we don't give him what he wants." Gideon turned to her, eyes dark with something close to regret. "You should hide." She shook her head. "I've buried too many men who stood alone." Outside, boots hit dirt. A fist hammered against the door. "Gideon, cross," a voice called. "Debts come due." Gideon exhaled slowly, then opened the door before they could break it down. Calhoun was taller than Gideon, his smile thin and cruel. "Thought you could disappear," he said. "Thought wrong." Margaret stepped forward before Gideon could stop her. "This is a peaceful town," she said. "Take your quarrel elsewhere." Calhoun laughed. "And who are you, sweetheart?" "A woman who remembers," Margaret replied. Something in her voice unsettled him. His eyes flicked to the ledger clutched in her hands. "What's that?" he asked. Before Gideon could answer, the ledger slipped from Margaret's grip and fell open on the porch. The wind flipped its pages. Names lifted from the paper like shadows ink, darkening, spreading, bleeding through the parchment. Margaret gasped. She had never seen this before. The book felt alive, heavy with choice and consequence. Calhoun's name appeared, fresh, black, unmistakable. The men froze. Gideon stared at the page, then at Margaret. "You didn't write that." "No," she whispered. "I didn't." Calhoun snarled and reached for his gun. The shot rang out like thunder. When the dust settled, Calhoun lay sprawled in the dirt, his hand inches from the weapon he never drew. Gideon stood rigid, smoke curling from his barrel, breath coming hard. The other men fled. Silence. Fell thick, stunned, sacred. Margaret knelt beside Calhoun's body, fingers trembling as she closed the ledger. When she opened it again, his name was already fading, as if satisfied. She turned to Gideon. His page was still there, but the date was gone. Gideon sank onto the steps, staring at his hands. "I was supposed to die." "You chose not to," Margaret said softly. "So did I." That night, Dry Creek buried Calhoun. Margaret wrote his name once clean and final and felt no guilt. Later, Gideon stood with her beneath the stars. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," he said, "but I want it to be here." Margaret took his hand. "Steady now." "Then write your own name," she said. "Not mine." For the first time in years, the ledger beneath her floorboard lay silent. Dry Creek remembered the night Calhoun died. Not because of the gunshot. Towns like Dry Creek were no strangers to those, because something shifted afterward. Men slept easier, Women lingered longer in the street. The air itself felt less heavy, as if the land had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Margaret felt the change most of all. For the first time in years, she woke without reaching for the ledger. It stayed beneath the floorboard, quiet and ordinary, no longer warm beneath her hands. When she finally opened it days later, no new names had appeared. The pages were still, their ink settled and calm, like water after a storm. Gideon stayed. He took steady work at the South Ranch, rebuilt the fence Calhoun's men had trampled, and learned the rhythm of a life not measured in escape routes. He laughed more now, soft, genuine laughter that reached his eyes. Sometimes Margaret caught him watching her with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe he was alive. They moved carefully at first, both marked by loss. Gideon spoke of the men he'd ridden with, the mistakes that chased him across half the territory. Margaret told him about Thomas, about the quiet love of a life cut short. They shared these truths like offerings, fragile but sincere. One evening, Gideon asked to see the ledger again. Margaret hesitated, then handed it to him. He flipped through the pages slowly, reading the names aloud under his breath. "They mattered," he said. "Yes," she replied. "They still do." When he reached the back, he paused. His name was still there, but now it stood alone, no date, no prophecy, no shadow clinging to it. "I think," Gideon said carefully, "that you're done writing futures." Margaret smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I think so too." Spring came early that year. Wildflowers dotted the hills beyond town, stubborn and bright. On a clear morning, Margaret carried the ledger up to Boot Hill. Gideon walked beside her, silent but steady. She stood before Thomas's grave and opened the book one last time. "I won't forget you," she whispered. "But I won't live among ghosts anymore." She buried the ledger beneath the earth, not as an ending, but as a promise. When they walked back down the hill, hand in hand, Dry Creek looked less like a stopping place and more like a beginning. Margaret no longer collected names. She collected mornings, shared meals, the sound of Gideon's boots on her floor, a future unwritten and gloriously uncertain. And for the first time, that was enough. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.